Why did trans people become such a popular topic in the 2010s? To many people, this seemed like a random cultural shift that kinda came out of nowhere. Like if society just got bored of its previous struggles and went out looking for some shiny new cultural thing to divide us over. The shift was actually a consequence of systemic and institutional changes that a lot of people were not paying attention to at the time, some of which simply resulted from research and understanding of trans people reaching a critical mass, where the opinion of establishment medical professionals was changing in response to accumulating evidence and an increasing volume of advocacy. In 2011, a major professional organization dedicated to research and treatment of trans people, known as the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, or HBIGDA, was renamed the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. In the following year, it published version 7 of its Standards of Care for the Health of Transgender and Gender Diverse People, often shortened to simply the Standards of Care, or the SOC. This was a major change from the previous version of the Standards of Care published in 2001. It finally discontinued the Benjamin Scale for diagnosing gender identity disorder. Although progressive for its time, having been developed by the very well-meaning Harry Benjamin as part of his 1966 book The Transsexual Phenomenon, the Benjamin Scale had become inconsistent with a modern understanding of gender identity. It also set much higher requirements for diagnosis than we have today because, well, this was a newer phenomenon at the time, so they were being cautious and trying to reduce liability for practitioners. The language and framing about transsexual, transgender, or gender diverse people was also updated, stressing that such people are not necessarily disordered. Overall, this change contributed to destigmatization, it led to transitioning being far more accessible for normal trans people, and it became a great resource for future advocacy and policymaking. In 2013, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, issued their 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, often called the DSM. This update not only replaced gender identity disorder with gender dysphoria, but reframed how we even think about these things from the identity itself being the disorder and a problem, to instead our goal being to address the anxiety or distress that such people experience, and that being the problem. Like the WPATH changes, this contributed to destigmatization and helped increase accessibility of care. The emergence of social media was also a noteworthy factor in increasing awareness of numerous social issues, including transgender identity, as it enabled emergent dialogue that might have not taken place otherwise at all, or at least not nearly to the same extent. In 2005, nobody had a smartphone. There was no such thing as Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, Tumblr, YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok. 7 years later, in 2012, all of those websites had become mainstream, well, except for TikTok, which took another 8 years or so. There are still people who don't fully recognize how much of a change this was for our culture, because of how it enabled people all throughout society to share information, to connect, and to engage in conversation about anything they wanted, and often in a semi-anonymous manner. This was huge for minority voices, or for voices that would have been marginalized in the previous decades and had difficulty breaking through the more centralized landscape of legacy media. The amount of discourse that took place focusing on race, gender, and sexuality suddenly exploded, because normal people started talking about it in a way that they weren't able to before. It was a decade of freedom and self-expression that people who grew up before this time rarely had access to. Then, in and around 2015, there were some major breakthroughs in mainstream cultural representation. This was the year that Caitlyn Jenner came out as transgender, the most high-profile person ever to do so. It shocked the world, and it sparked God knows how many conversations in how many households across America. Normal people who had never heard of a transgender before suddenly became very much aware. It was also in 2015 that I Am Jazz, a reality television show spotlighting transgender teenager Jazz Jennings, debuted on TLC with mainstream support, funding, and attention. This girl literally looks at the camera and says she has a penis. They were not playing around. There's no way for it to go over your head. There's something very empowering about discovering or developing the language and concepts with which to make sense of the world around you. The random lines become a pattern, the noise becomes music, the mess becomes a system that you can predict and navigate. I remember when I was very young, the first time that I read about gender dysphoria or trans people. It's a really eye-opening experience to connect that with what you've been feeling and experiencing for so long. If those resources don't exist and these conversations never happen, then yeah, there will be some people who have the internal quality of being trans who just never quite put it together. So if society goes in the other direction and openly addresses these things while also being accepting of the people who come out, it's going to seem like the number of trans people goes up. Not because more are being created, but because more are becoming self-aware and choosing to be open about it.